And greetings, and welcome back to another Perspectives. It's been a while, um, and I guess there was nothing that crossed my radar that I wish to speak about. Um, but recently, I've been abroad in Germany, and I came back only a few days ago. I've been invited to attend a conference, medical congress there, to give a talk which was titled "The Wounded Mind: The Psychosis of the Modern World," and shortly there'll be another video after this where I'll represent my talk. But I just wanted to talk about the subject of trauma, um, because one of the things I noticed on this visit, and it's not the first time, I've noticed it in my last few kind of travels in the last 18 months or so, is that it it seems that travel, and especially air travel, is becoming increasingly uncomfortable compared to how it was several years ago. And in Europe, air travel had become almost like taking taxis. There was so much air travel around close European neighbours. But recently, and especially in the last 18 months, it's becoming increasingly uncomfortable, and I think that's because of the procedures being put into place for travelling, and such as the way the airports are set up. They always seem to be overcrowded, over busy, and there always seem to be delays in moving through the airport, especially through the baggage checks and etc. And it just seems as if they're, you know, I don't know, as if they were not prepared for the amount of people traveling, but also the way that they form you into pre-queues to get ready a long time before the boarding. Um, but the whole thing just seems more stressful and a more traumatic experience to travel than it used to be. And in my last few travels, I've always had some problems on trains. Getting to the airport, a train was delayed. Some trains have been cancelled. We had to take alternatives. Even on this trip, my train going out had a cancellation, and I had difficulty in trains in Germany for being late and missing connections. And on the way back, the train back in England, although I had a reserved seat, for some reason, the train company had doubly overbooked the train, and there was people uh, completely in the aisles and in the juncture corridor between carriages. It was just chaotic. And then given us trains um, which no longer can fit your luggage in the rack above the head, only very small, like plastic bags. It couldn't fit any hand luggage. So, so everyone had to kind of sit on top of their luggage. So the whole thing just seems, and one has to wonder whether there's some kind of deliberate dysfunction in place, as well as the normal dysfunction, adding to a double dysfunction. As if, of course, and these ways of travel are only travel for the masses. You know, those people who are, um, let's say, of a certain, of course, position never travel the way that we do. They travel in private jets and have their own smooth kind of travel transactions. So there's something there, but I think it's adding to the kind of trauma that's already quite blatant in the world today. Because one of the things that I was talking about was that people are more and more externalizing their trauma and engaging in collective trauma. And again, I'll recommend or suggest that people look at the following video that I'll release on my talk on the wounded mind to go into more detail. So there's an externalization of trauma, and also there. I talked about how there seems to be a certain rise in certain types of personality disorders, which is called Group B personality disorders, and these include the borderline personality disorder, the antisocial personality disorder, the narcissistic, and the histrionic, which I've also talked about. But of course, there was always a certain level of trauma in society, and it seems as if human life is kind of traumatic in itself. Even the process of being born can be traumatic, depending on how we're being delivered and the stresses involved from both sides, from the mother and the child. And then, of course, we go through the trauma of growing up and trying to be socialized. We may go through bullying at school, um, and that's on the increase. When I was at school, it was more kind of playful bullying, but now it's um, quite more dramatic and traumatic. And then, of course, there's the online bullying and trolling, as they call it, that some youngsters and teenagers have committed suicide from. And then, of course, society with the stress of jobs, of also of the travel for going to work, and there seems to be an increase in the random acts of violence. So there's trauma already in society, but of course, in the last couple of years, especially since 2020, as we know, there's been an increase in trauma, and not only because of the events, but because of the responses, the societal responses to those events, um, causing greater fear and alienation. And one of the sense of having a kind of externalizing of the trauma is a lack of social bonds, which was, kind of extenuated and increased through the enforced lockdowns. And there was the fear of going out and the fear of contact and contagion at these times. And it all added to what was already existing as certain forms of trauma. And it's almost as if the trauma had become normalized more in our society. And now it's becoming normalized through what were quite normally mundane circumstances, such as catching a train and traveling. And it seems like a lot more of this interaction and engagement in our physical lives is more and more stressful. And and just as I was thinking about this after my return trip in the last couple of days, how stressful traveling is compared to how it used to be. Just yesterday, there came up in one of my feeds a news article from Medical Journal, which is the American Psychological Association, about the increased levels of stress, which of course took my interest. And so, looking at this, and I'll put the link below in the notes. It's from the American Psychological Association, and this post was created November the 1st, 2023, so it's very recent. And the headline is Stress in America 2023, a nation grappling with psychological impacts of collective trauma. And just the opening short paragraph says, US society appears to be experiencing the psychological impacts of a collective trauma in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic, according to the results of a new survey by the American Psychological Association. Psychologists warn that a superficial characterization of life being back to normal, they quote, is obscuring the post-traumatic effects on mental and physical health. Now, as I mentioned, there were already traumatic effects on society and on our mental and emotional health before the events of the last 2 or 3 years, but it's been exacerbated and strengthened or heightened because of what's happened. But interestingly, there was a talk given at the conference that I went to, and it was from a professor in some kind of clinical health and psychological health in the University of Innsbruck in Austria. I cannot remember the professor's name, but it was one of the speakers, and he spoke in English so I could follow it. And what he was saying was that they'd done neurological studies of, in the last few years, of people under stress and the release of the hormone cortisol. And as we know, as we may know, cortisol is a hormone which is released specifically through from the brain, which is a response to stress and chronic stress, and the continued presence of this cortisol being released by the brain can lead to increased cognitive dysfunction, or rather can accelerate cognitive dysfunction or the decay of cognitive capacities in a human being, which is why we don't wish to be under stress continually. And anyone who lives a life of chronic stress will then, of course, have the possibility that they have negative impacts on their cognitive capacity over time. And these are clinical facts, nothing new there. Nobody wants to live a life of stress, do we now? But what this professor was saying, and he was making he did his study in the last few years ever since the pandemic. And what he seemed to be saying was that there were certain aspects of a biological presence that seemed to be almost geared up, or almost as if created or manufactured to respond more aggressively to people who had heightened cortisol or heightened hormones from stress. So if this biological entity was more virulent and therefore affected more those people who were in states of stress, and because of the cortisol in their bodies, but of course we know the cortisol in stress also lowers the immune system. So what the professor was saying was, it seemed from his perspective a kind of obviously speaking very delicately and very diplomatically, it was a kind of misjudgment from governments around the world in their response to the situation by enforcing lockdowns and encouraging and promoting fear, because the very factor of socially promoted fear and enforced lockdowns and alienation and the stress that comes from this, it actually gave an advantage for the virulency of particular biological entity. So those factors seem to work together. So these factors just kind of came across my radar. So what response do we have to that? The response is, we must ensure that we can do whatever we can to decrease and lessen and decrease the factors of stress and, of course, fear. We should never really have fear or abstract fear. Genuine fear is another matter, depends on our context and circumstances. But abstract fear, we should not be encouraged to transfer any free-floating anxieties or any free-floating sense of fear onto these external events or entities or objects. And because that fear plus any sense of stress will not be healthy at all for our state of being, state of health, and it will affect and decrease the capacity of our immune system. And of course, we all want to be healthy. We all want a good, strong immune system. And especially for the future that we're all hopefully looking forward to in these tumultuous times ahead. But of course, we have to get to the future first by stepping over the stones and pebbles of a fallen present world around us. So I would just say, let us be mindful that we really do need to ensure that the life we live, the days we live, and what we accept in our lives around us, both people, events, and circumstances, that we ensure that what we engage with is a life not of stress, not of fear, and not to put ourselves out to the vulnerability that comes from engagement with increasing stress. So let us chill and find ways, can be small ways that give us joy and relaxing, whether it's reading, like I do, and or cooking, or going for walks, or just engaging with those small moments, or playing with a little dog or cat. Find those ways to de-stress. Of course, stroking an animal is a very good way to de-stress. If you don't have an animal, maybe go out and stroke a tree. They'll all appreciate it. So what I'm saying is that, as always, it's important to stay focused, stay balanced, stay stress-free in order to be healthy, and above all, to stay grounded. Okay, cheers. Until next time.